Coming to you from the Forge of Freedom studio in the heart of America. A podcast dedicated to preserving freedom and inspiring personal success. Freedom is born and lives through you, the individual, and it dies in the shadows of tyranny. Motivating our listeners to become well-rounded, freedom-minded people with the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior. The tree of liberty lives on through you, the Forge of Freedom. And now here's your host, Alex Ooley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 47 of the Forge of Freedom. Today I have an attorney and firearms instructor, Mike Ooley, back in the studio for Monday Gun Day to finish up our segment about Massad Ayoob's 10 Commandments for Concealed Carry. Welcome to the show again, Mike.
Hey, Alex, thanks for having me. I hope we finish. Sometimes I talk too much.
We got through 4 last week, and we're going to finish up the next 6 this week. Although last week we spent some time at the beginning talking about his book and then also the prelude to the episode with Stephen Hallbrook. So today we'll get right into the 5th commandment.
I like your optimism.
Yes, exactly. But just to recap, the first 4, if you carry, make it a habit, always carry as much as possible. Number 2, don't carry if you're not prepared to use it. Number 3, don't let the gun make you reckless. And number 4, get the license or permit, even if you live in a state that is constitutional carry or permitless carry, and for lots of reasons. And if you haven't listened to that episode yet, I'll link to it in the show notes. Make sure you go back and listen to last week's Monday Gun Day episode so you can get caught up.
Yeah, and this is the book, Massad Ayoob's book, that the notion of 10 Commandments didn't start there, but he explains where this notion of the 10 Commandments from Massad Ayoob started. Chapter 14, and that's, if you want to, I'd suggest you get this book. There's now a second edition out. Get the second edition, of course. And that's the book.
And if you're not watching by video, he's pointing to the book, Deadly Force, Understanding Your Right to Self-Defense, and I'll link to that in the show notes as well.
And if you don't know who Massad Ayoob is, he's a preeminent authority in the area of self-defense, an expert witness, a trainer, an instructor, and an all-around great guy. So you need to read his books, in particular this book. And if he has something to say in this area, listen to him.
Yeah. So with that said, Mike, let's get into number 5, where we left off from last week. Know what you are doing.
Yeah, and the key here is to learn the rules of the road. I mentioned in the end, sort of quickly, of the episode before this, where we talked about the 10 Commandments. A good source is handgunlaw.us. So if you've got your handgun permit, or if you're a constitutional carry person, that's great too. But still go there and understand the ins and outs. I mean, can you carry in a place that serves alcohol? Can you carry in a church? Do no gun signs in a business have validity at law so that you could be charged with an infraction or a crime? Or you got to know all of these things. So I would suggest you go to handgunlaw.us. Make sure your permit's good in another state. By the way, one thing I didn't mention last time, we suggested folks get their permit, even if they're a constitutional carry state or a permitless carry state. There's nothing wrong with getting more than one permit. I know I have more than one permit, one from Indiana and Florida. My Florida permit is a non-resident permit, and it gives me, I hate to say it gives me my constitutional right. It's crazy to have to say that, but it provides that I can carry in a couple of other 2 or 3 states out west. I think, well, I'm not even going to say, look it up at handgunlaw.us, maybe Nebraska, New Mexico, but don't rely upon that. Look it up.
For reciprocity purposes, another popular state to obtain a license is Utah. Somebody that I know teaches the Utah class, Charlie Cook. He's on the Bullet podcast quite often. He's from Massachusetts, but he teaches classes to the Utah licensing standards so that folks can get the Utah license for reciprocity. So if that's something that's interesting to you, check out Florida, Utah, wherever.
But make sure you know those things. Like I have a Florida non-resident permit. Well, guess what? Here's a little, for instance, you got to know the intricacies. I'm almost certain that South Carolina did at least, recognized a Florida resident permit, but not a non-resident permit. Sort of a weird little thing. So you got to know all those little things.
So number 5, know what you're doing. There's a lot to know here.
Yeah.
And there are lots of pitfalls or traps if you're not careful, if you don't know where to look. You mentioned handgunlaw.us. What other thoughts do you have?
Well, you don't want to be a felon for these. I want you to explain that real quickly, if you don't mind. We don't become a felon just because you don't know some piece of bureaucratic law out there. There are laws out there that are malum in se, and there are laws out there that are malum prohibitum. Can you explain the distinction and why we don't want you to become the victim of the malum prohibitum law is what we're really getting to here?
So, sure. So first of all, there's not an equivalent between the law and morality. Sometimes there are laws which are called malum prohibitum, which are laws that there's nothing wrong about them, inherently wrong about them. Nothing wrong, for instance, with going over the speed limit, going 58 and a 55, but it's wrong because the legislature has said it's wrong.
The king said it was wrong.
Right. Or carrying a firearm in a church. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but some states prohibit that exercise. I think it's wholly unconstitutional, but nevertheless, some states have that sort of prohibition. And there are lots of those malum prohibitum laws with respect to the exercise of your right to keep and bear arms. There are also malum in se laws, which are laws that criminalize behaviors that are inherently wrong, like murder, like rape, etc., like battery, robbery, those sorts of things that actually harm someone else, and that we know intuitively are wrong, irrespective of whether or not there's a law against it.
And there's lots of pitfalls out there in mines for the legally armed citizen to fall into with respect to these laws that are simply malum prohibitum.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned handgunlaw.us. It's a great place to start for that. If you're not sure, if you go to handgunlaw.us, it links to the actual statutes in the state, so you can actually find the original source. There are other comparable resources, but we prefer handgunlaw.us.
So be careful who you get your information from or your advice from with respect to these firearms laws. And we see this not only in carry, we see this in, for instance, in class 3 items, silencers or suppressors, some people call them. So you just have to know all these intricacies when it comes to firearms. Another thing, though, that I want to point out when we talk about knowing what you're doing, it doesn't mean just all the laws out there in terms of where you can carry and where you can't carry, where it's prohibited, not prohibited. We're talking about what to do. I'll go back to Colonel Cooper, and that was a long time ago. We had a podcast on him, and he always talked about the combat triad, and that is being competent in the marksmanship arena, the gun handling arena, and having the right mindset. So those are where you need to know what you're doing as well. You know what you're doing, that begets confidence, and then that confidence lets potential predators know that you're not going to be good prey. So it's important that you be competent in all those areas. You need to have a skill level. Your marksmanship and your gun handling need to be at what we say is the unconscious competence level. And what that means is it's just automatic. You don't have to think about it. You just do it. It's like tying your shoes. Although some people under enormous pressure may not be able to tie their shoes, but it's so you do these things. It's Michael Jordan taking the jump shot. He doesn't think about where his feet are, where his hands are. It just happens so naturally because he's done it hundreds, if not millions of times before. So that's where you need to be with that gun handling stuff. You know, the ability to manipulate the firearm, your marksmanship, those things, and know what you're doing so that you can process all the legal questions that you may be presented with at the time about whether or not, not only whether or not you're authorized to shoot, but whether you should shoot or not. Yeah. So it's important you understand those things. It's important you understand the legal aftermath. It's important you understand the emotional aftermath. We have episodes about that. Of course, the legal aftermath is important for your future freedom. The emotional aftermath and understanding that helps us avoid the more negative consequences of being involved in a life or death situation.
Yeah, when you're under attack, you don't want to have to think about your sight alignment, your sight picture, your trigger press, your grip, your stance, all those things. Those things need to be second nature so that you can think about and comprehend the situation before you and how to address it.
Yeah, and this can come from training. We need to have people need to seek out competent training. They need to dry fire if they can do so safely. Won't go into all that dry firing right now, but that's a great way to train. But it's important that, you know, we understand those things and we can perform. We do them at the unconscious competence level so that we can perform when we're under stress. It's amazing to us. We teach some classes where not the beginning class, but we teach some classes where we have a timer and people are, you know, you hear that beep, you know, shooter ready, and that, you know, you got that timer and they hear the beep. And it's amazing how folks stress out on a square range just with that timer requirement happening. I mean, if you're stressed, and by the way, I applaud people that do that. Go out, get training, get put under pressure, fail, because you'll get better as a result of it. Because the stress of somebody shooting at you is going to be much more than the stress of a timer going off in the background so that you perform, or with you thinking about you need to perform at a certain level.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some stress inoculation going on there, but you're also just pushing the limits of your ability. And sometimes that requires failure. And I don't remember, maybe this is, you mentioned Michael Jordan. I think this was actually his quote that says something like, I have failed over and over again in my life, and that's why I succeed. Mm-hmm. And that's really what you should be striving to do. You shouldn't be striving for failure, but you should be pushing your limits, because the only person you're competing with when you're training is yourself, your former self.
It's like sometimes we have a class, we do this sort of derivation of a tooler drill. It's not, you know, you're not running at people with guns and knives, but it's to sort of demonstrate the concept. And a lot of times we demonstrate this and we do it in a perfectly safe environment and a safe manner, but people don't want to engage in these exercises. This is a kind of an extra add-on sort of exercise we do, but they don't want to necessarily step forward and doing it. And, you know, from my standpoint, because I mean, they're afraid they're going to fail in front of folks. For instance, there's going to be a timer. You're going to see how they perform. That's the time to do it. It doesn't matter at that juncture. Yeah. And if you can't do it there, it's going to be hard to do it when it's for real and somebody's trying to kill you.
Yeah. So number 5, know what you are doing.
Yeah. And I'm going to give you a little bonus to know what you're doing, why you ought to know what you're doing too. Tom Givens. And this is from an article I have here from Chris Baker, who's truly a squared away guy as well, who is associated with Lucky Gunner. They sell ammunition online, and he has lots of videos and lots of blog articles, and I think incredibly competent, an incredible source of good information and advice. But he had, I think, there's a little excerpt, and I think Tom Givens teaches this. I have not trained with Tom Givens. Doris, my wife, has taken his, I don't know how many hours it is, class. It's his, I don't know, it's 2 or 3 days anyway, maybe. I'm not sure. But anyway, Doris has taken it, and my son, Alex's brother, has taken, Doris's son has taken it as well. But anyway, here's a little excerpt from it. He used to teach, or used to own, I think, Rangemaster in Memphis, Tennessee. And he taught there for a number of years. You'll have to do the research there. But Tom Givens has got lots of experience, a very wise man. But, and this is probably a little dated, but at the time it was written in 2021, think about the fact that a lot of his students probably are from the Memphis area, relatively high crime rate in that area. But he had 67, this is the benefit of being trained. He kept record of this, and at the time, it's probably higher now, he had 67 students involved in incidents where they fired shots as a result of being attacked in some form. I understand these were usually armed robbery or some attempt at some sort of sexual assault or whatever is usually what they were. But he had 3 students that were killed out of those 67 when they were involved in those violent encounters. Do you know why they were killed?
I do.
And what's the answer?
They were unarmed.
They were unarmed. And what was our number 1 commandment?
Always carry.
Always carry.
Yeah.
They were unarmed. That's who was killed.
Pants on, gun on.
Yep. The 3 students who were killed out of the 67 were unarmed. The other 64 fought back and survived, and only 3 had minor injuries. And none of them were convicted of any wrongdoing whatsoever. So that's the bonus to knowing what you're doing and being armed. Those 3 students who weren't armed at the time are the only ones that ultimately lost that. Now they're in the gunfight they were in, or the fight they were in. A couple other interesting things about this article. He indicated that 87%, this is knowing what you're doing too, and expecting what's going to happen in the gunfight. 87% of these happened in the 3 to 5 yard range. So that gives you some inclination of where these incidents may occur. I also understand what usually happened in most of these 67 incidents is the perpetrator started from a distance quite a ways away to kind of test the person out to see if they would be compliant. To see, that's when they're kind of doing that thin slicing we talked about in the other episode. And then if they thought the potential victim was going to be compliant or let them into their personal space, that's when they moved in and finally attempted to commit the, whether it was an armed robbery or sexual assault or whatever. So anyway, there's some real numbers from a real trainer to tell you what training can do for you. Now, I can't tell you what would have happened to those same 67 people had they not been trained, but I would submit to you that things would have turned out differently in terms of these statistics.
The success rate of his students that were armed was 100% survival rate.
Correct.
3 out of the 67 perished because they were unarmed.
Correct.
Yeah. So know what you're doing. This is an illustration of that. One other resource that we've pointed people to in past episodes is John Correa's Active Self-Protection website. We talk a lot about visualization and thinking through how you would handle particular scenarios. And obviously, we can't be in gunfights to practice these things. And thank goodness, there are other ways to prepare for this potential threat. And Active Self-Protection, their YouTube channel, is a great resource for that. John Correa has analyzed over 40,000 incidents, self-defense incidents, and has lots of great commentary and lessons learned from those videos. So I'll link to that in the show notes as well. Encourage you too to look at Lucky Gunner, but also the Range Master. They still put out a newsletter that they post on their website. That's an excellent resource as well.
Absolutely. And seek out training with Tom Givens and his wife. They travel around the country and do training.
Yeah.
A great, like I said, I haven't trained, but I know from endorsements from Doris and Ryan that it's in fact a worthwhile endeavor. Yeah. And keep in mind that his folks, I don't know, these 67 people, I don't know that they had 120 hours of firearms training. They may have only had 2 or 3 or 4 days of firearms training, maybe the limit of their firearms training. So it's always that deal. Alex, you and I, we're trying to outrun the bear that's going to eat us. You don't have to outrun the bear. You just have to outrun me. So you don't have to be Kyle Lamb and a Delta Force guy to be trained and competent, but it's important that you invest the time and effort in some training.
You have to be better than your attacker.
Yep.
And thankfully, most criminals are not very well trained. But you want to give yourself margin of error for sure.
All right. So let's keep up. I'm always dragging the ship here to get.
So we're number 5. Know what you are doing. Number 6, and remember here we're talking about the 10 commandments of concealed carry that Massad Ayoob has given us. Number 6 is concealed means concealed. And you want to explain that one a little bit, Mike?
Yeah, just that. I mean, I think this one's
pretty
self-explanatory. Depending on where you live, it may be illegal to carry what we call open carry, meaning the firearm is completely visible to everybody. But we don't think it's a good idea to open carry. Don't get me wrong. I understand what people are trying to do to inoculate people to the presence of a firearm. I think that's a good thing. But at the same time, I think if you open carry, you're giving up a lot tactically. You're opening yourself up to a bad guy knowing you have a firearm and maybe making allegations that you threaten somebody or brandishing a firearm. There are all these extra risks out there that I don't think that most people need. So I guess what I'd say is if you want to open carry, fine. Make sure it's in you have some sort of holster that is a good retention holster. I see some of these numbskulls walking around with nylon holsters and the thing stuck in their back, and almost anybody could take the firearm from them and beat them over the head with it. So don't be one of those guys. If you're going to open carry, make sure you have a professional retention holster of some sort.
But we highly recommend concealed carry over open carry just from a tactical perspective because for lots of reasons. But number one, it makes you less of a target.
And you may be the police, depending on where you live and the jurisdiction and the knowledge of the police. I mean, you may be stopped and borderline harassed or even harassed by police for open carrying a firearm. You may get some crazy person that's scared, that you're carrying a firearm and call the police. I mean, what the police ought to say when some crazy person calls them and says, "Oh, I just saw somebody carrying a firearm," assuming it's legal in that jurisdiction, the police ought to say, "Okay, fine, that's perfectly legal. Don't worry about it. It's no different than an umbrella." But anyway, sometimes the police will still come out because they purportedly have some duty at that juncture to come out and ask you questions. So you might avoid that as well.
So number 5, know what you're doing. Number 6, concealed means concealed. Now to number 7, maximize your firearms familiarity. And we alluded to this one a little bit when we discussed number 5, because we want our familiarity with the use of our firearm to be second nature. We want to have unconscious competence with the safe gun handling and marksmanship skills that we need to use it effectively. So we want to build on that a little bit, Mike.
Yeah, I want to say one more thing about the concealed. I mean, we're advocating concealed carry, but that doesn't mean you conceal it in such a way that you can't get to it. I want you to think through how quickly you can get to, shots on target. The faster you can do that, the more leeway you have with a potential perpetrator not to have to even expose your firearm. So make sure when we want you to carry concealed, but we're not real fans of purse carry because it's hard to get it out. Somebody may take your purse. Make sure you're efficient with your concealed carry. Yeah. Maximize your firearms familiarity. You need to be able to manipulate that firearm in the dark, in adverse conditions. When we first start training people at the range, I mean, we make them visually check their gun to make sure it's unloaded, visually and physically. We make them do certain things as far as loading and unloading, not looking at when they're loading the gun. People on the range sometimes think, well, it's bright in here, it's air conditioned, it's great, I can do all these things. But the environment you're in when you use a firearm may not be so easy, so conducive. You may have other things going on. You may have to open a door. You may have to talk on the phone. You may have to hold a child. There's all kinds of things. You may have to treat yourself for a wound. You may have to treat somebody else. So it's important that we put away the difficulties of operating our firearm to that portion of our mind where it just goes on autopilot in its unconscious competence. That comes with being familiar with our firearm. Some people, I think this commandment stands for the proposition that, if you got a firearm that you carry, the one you have in your little safe in your nightstand ought to be the same one, so they're not different. And you're just familiar with that firearm. It also, I think, stands for the proposition that it's a good idea to think about in this time when ammunition is high, and even for beginners who are recoil sensitive, you may want to think about a 22 caliber firearm that has identical ergonomics to your carry gun so that you can train and practice with one at a lower cost. You may be able to start your wife or your spouse. I guess I shouldn't say your wife. You may be the female and your husband's the one that can't operate the firearm, whatever. It's a way to get a beginner started on a particular type of firearm. I'll give you, for instance, and I'm not trying to advocate for Glock or anything like that, but they have a Glock model 44 and 22 caliber that's identical, or I'll say nearly identical. You should never say absolute, but it's nearly identical to a Glock 19 in dimensions, ergonomics, slide stop, yada, 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 all those sorts of things. So it would be good to train with that Glock 44 and 22 caliber. And, then you can use you carry the Glock 19.
And I don't have the episode number in front of me, but I'll link to it in the show notes. We did a Monday Gun Day episode about selecting a firearm for self-defense, selecting a handgun for self-defense more specifically. And we got into a lot of those details, but there are certainly a lot of considerations to take with respect to that selection. But no matter what you select for your firearm, make sure that you maximize your familiarity with that firearm so that your handling of that particular firearm becomes second nature.
Yeah, we want you to get that to the level of unconscious competence. Now, I want to caution you, though, it's possible that you're going to have to operate another firearm in certain scenarios. It may not be your firearm that you have to pick up somewhere and use. It may be somebody else's. So I think it's still important to at least know how to operate and make safe other firearms. If you're a young guy or gal in his 20s you may not be familiar with a 1911 how to operate that because it's an older style gun. You might be, but it's a good idea to make sure you know how to operate all of these guns. Frankly, I'll tell you a story. Some people come to our class and they bring some funky guns, and I'm like I'm definitely not at the unconscious competence level in terms of how to operate these things in terms of the manual safeties and the manual of arms. So anyway, just keep that in mind. It's still a good secondary skill to operate anything.
Yeah. And especially, I think that's especially true if you carry a different firearm than your spouse. At least know how to use the other firearms in your household, certainly. And if you have the time and resources to train with other firearms as well, it's good to be familiar with various styles and functions of firearms, but certainly make the firearm you carry and the one that your spouse keeps or carries second nature.
Yep.
Number 8, understand the fine points. We alluded to this one a little bit with know what you're doing in number 5, so I think we skipped ahead a little bit. But this number 8 is really about avoiding those pitfalls that we talked about earlier with respect to, can you carry in a church? Can you carry in a bar? Do no gun signs have the force of law? Do you have a duty to inform the police officer if you're stopped for a traffic violation? Those sorts of things. You don't want to get caught up in violating those sorts of malum prohibitum laws that we talked about earlier. So make sure, whether it's in the state where you live or in a state where you're traveling, you know what the law is in those particular states on those issues, because you want to avoid those traps.
Absolutely. And they are quite different from state to state.
Yeah. So that's number 8. Number 9, carry an adequate firearm. And again, I'd point you to the episode where we talked about selection of a firearm here. But Mike, you want to hit a few of the highlights here about what it means, number 9, to carry an adequate firearm?
Yeah. And this is a matter of opinion, I suppose, to a great extent. And I don't beat me up over this, but I'll make the general statement without a footnote again. Here I'm talking about footnotes. I think if you're not carrying a 38 special, a 38 Smith & Wesson special, or a 380 or larger, you really are running the risk of not having a firearm that will safely and effectively stop a threat of death or grave bodily harm to you or another innocent person. So that's sort of, I think, kind of the consensus in the training community. You ought to be carrying a 38 special or a 380 or above in terms of caliber.
Yeah, I think for beginners, we often start out beginners in our classes with 22, just so that they can master the fundamentals. But we certainly recommend, if people can move up to 380 ACP or 38 Smith & Wesson or 38 Special, that they should do that at least. We think 9mm is in our estimation the optimal one to carry, but some other people have different preferences. The 9mm versus 45 debate is an ongoing and probably debate that will be going on for years to come. But carry what you can comfortably carry and shoot effectively, but we'd say at least 380 as a starting point.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm a big believer in, if you're a novice, start off with that 22, but pick one that has an analogous centerfire cartridge, a 9mm. So pick that semi-automatic 22 that's almost the same as the centerfire equivalent. Or if you want a revolver, there are 22 revolvers you can start with, and then move to the centerfire revolvers as well.
Yeah.
A corollary here too, I'll go ahead and mention, if you don't mind, there's some debate about whether you got to carry a second gun or not. That you may think folks are paranoid about that. Some people do. I don't know that it's ever been used a whole lot in the civilian or in the private citizen sector. I'm aware of some folks that carry them, not so much for themselves, but they may use them so that they can give one to their spouse or somebody else. If you're going to do that, it obviously has to be a gun that probably pretty simple, like a revolver, that somebody else could use, or you can use it as a backup too. Clint Smith always said, or still says, 1 is none, 2 is 1. So I'll leave it to you about backup guns and their effectiveness. And then the other thing is whether you carry spare magazines or not. Is obviously police officers should do that. Whether private citizens should do that or not is another question. A lot of times magazine malfunctions are the primary cause for firearm malfunction. So maybe it's important there. But then again, it's my understanding John Correa has looked at 40,000 plus incidents of gunfights and never seen a reload important or needed in a private citizen's gunfight. He has with respect to law enforcement, but not private citizens.
Yeah. So, and the other aspect of this carry an adequate firearm that I think I should mention just briefly, we talked about caliber and talk about backup gun, but also I think importantly is reliability of your firearm and the ammunition. And whatever firearm and ammunition you choose, you should shoot at least 100 rounds. I'd like to shoot a little more than that through the firearm with the particular ammunition to make sure that that ammunition works well in the firearm that you're going to be carrying.
Yeah, and maybe we can do an episode on ammunition sometime, although I'm not an expert in ammunition, but the reliability is important. It's more important than what I've talked about so far under this category. Last class, I think we had a firearm that malfunctioned for the person. That was their self-defense gun too, and it was malfunctioning on the range. I've seen folks come up, their carry ammo is what we call ball ammo. Not a good idea. It's not the optimum solution for a 9mm. So yeah, not only do you carry an adequate firearm, you have to define adequate as reliable.
And I don't want to say too much here, but you say you're not an expert on ammunition. I think you know far more than the average person or the layman, but I think by that you mean you don't know all the different varieties out there necessarily, or keep up to date with the latest.
Yeah, I can't tell you. I don't keep up with all the marketing and a gazillion, every possible test scenario.
But we do have lots of experience with people that bring ammunition to our classes and how well it works, and then also, the various studies and stuff that we've seen.
Yeah, but I've not done ballistic testing, and right. I think back when I say I'm not an expert, the guy, and I can't, his name escapes me now, but he was a trauma surgeon. We took a seminar and he understood, and that's really what I meant, man. He understood ammunition and its effects on people and whether this was better than that and those sorts of things. He was can't remember his name. It was at a seminar that we went to, but anyway, it was incredibly interesting to listen to a trauma surgeon talk about that, somebody who had actually operated on lots and lots of people who'd been shot.
So just to recap here real quickly, number 5, know what you're doing. Number 6, concealed means concealed. Number 7, maximize your firearms familiarity. Number 8, understand the fine points, avoid those legal pitfalls. Number 9, carry an adequate firearm. And then finally, the last of the 10 commandments for concealed carry is use common sense. You want to say a little bit about that, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of gets summed up, and I mentioned, don't do stupid things with stupid people and stupid places at stupid times. And just think about that and avoid those places. Most of what we've talked about this whole time is common sense. Don't think about what I can do. Think about what I should do in any particular situation. And it's important that we all, and I mean us all, people that carry firearms, it's important that we exercise that right responsibly, because every time we don't exercise it responsibly, that's a little piece of ammunition for the anti-gunners, the anti-freedom, the anti-rights people to try to make some public policy argument that justifies the taking away of our rights. Of course, the notion that public policy is what should guide whether or not we have our God-given rights is absurd. But nonetheless, we don't want to give them any ammunition for those arguments.
Yeah. So once again, we mentioned it at the beginning of the episode, but this was our second iteration with respect to Massad Ayoob's 10 Commandments for concealed carry. Last week, we released the first episode about the 10 Commandments, went through the first 4. We got through the last 6 today, and we're drawing this from the Deadly Force book by Massad Ayoob primarily. So we certainly encourage you to check that out. Deadly Force, Understanding Your Right to Self-Defense. I'll link to that in the show notes. Mike, anything else you'd like to add before we close up the show here?
No, just like you said, go back and look at the book and look at these often and kind of grade yourself on how you're doing with these things.
Yeah. We, as a lot of you know who have listened in regularly, we did a series on selecting a firearm and sort of things you need to know prior to the act of self-defense. And then we also had a series about the aftermath. But we thought this 10 Commandments discussion was a useful add-on to that discussion as well. So I hope you learned something, hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for future Monday Gun Day episodes. We don't know for sure what topic we'll be covering next week, but sure Mike will be back in the studio for Monday Gun Day. And until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter at Forge of Freedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.